Good morning.
Good morning.
We've got a lot of folks here today. A lot of happy mothers. We ought to all be happy. You know, I'm going to come back to the next life. I want to have Chris's hairdo. I think I'd look real good with your hair. We could trade.
We're getting closer to that.
It's good to have everyone here this morning, and I'm glad to get to be able to speak with you. It's a real honor to get to come and share a few words with you. I know we have some from out of town. I don't know which ones you are, so that's okay. If I say something that offends you, you know I didn't mean it. Whatever that means. I come from a southwest Oklahoma family, and being Mother's Day, I thought, you know, I wanted to share just a little bit, just 2 minutes about my mom. I've already lived 20 years more than my mom was able to live on this earth. We lost her at 47. She married when she was 17. And I think Daddy had just turned 18 and, you know, they got permission and went out and got married. She came from a family, her dad had died on a homestead in dusty, dry, dusty south part of south of Indiana, southwestern Oklahoma. Trying to make a living on 160 acres, and her dad died when she was 3 years old. She was the baby, and basically lived on handouts from the rest of the family that kept them going through really hard times during the Depression years. A hard life. So when my dad, who wasn't wealthy at all, asked her to marry him, I think she thought she was going to be the queen of whatever. It was a great opportunity for her, and they were much in love. And he launched out and borrowed money to buy 20 milk cows. And for a few years anyway, they first started out milking cows by hand. And she couldn't have thought of a better life. I remember a lot of things about my mom. One thing came to mind just recently. I'll share that after this one. But anyway, we were not a wealthy family. We ate, while other families sometimes went out to lunch after church on Sundays, we had to go home and eat every Sunday. Always the same: fried chicken or roast beef, mashed potatoes and gravy, green beans, fried okra, homemade bread. You know, we weren't able to go out and enjoy like all other families and eat out. Understand, I'm looking back and very thankful for my upgrowing days. My mom was quite the homemaker, and I began to see how much she was a homemaker. We went on a trip to Washington, D.C. one year, the only trip really I remember as a family, and we tailgated out of one of these old station wagons where the seat turns backwards, you know, remember that? And we tailgated. We slept on the sides of the roads and parks, and it was kind of planned out, I guess, and ate sandwiches. I don't think we went out to eat any. They would go to the store and buy it, and we ate out on the tailgate of the car, and it was a great vacation. I thought it was wonderful. What a servant. And I always wondered why my mama liked the back and the neck of a chicken. Anybody remember how to tin-piece a chicken? We buy them already pieced down these days. Anyway, tin-piecing a chicken, you know, we always had people over for Sunday dinner. I don't remember it was ever just us. If somebody else was there, so you had to spread the chicken around, and it just marveled me as a child why my mom preferred the neck and the back. It's the way moms are, aren't they? We had tornadoes last week, and it reminded me of my mom. I told James this story. I was having baseball practice about a mile from home, and walked home. And I was supposed to come straight home, especially, I ought to be watching the clouds. And I didn't. I got to playing in this tunnel thing, and me and a friend, and we just lost track of time. By the time we started walking on home, wind was blowing, it was dark, trees were starting to crack, and I came into the yard, and there was my mom. She hugged me first, and then switched me all the way to the cellar. First the hug, and then a switching all the way to the cellar. Our cellar was full of people. All the neighbors were there. I was the only one out in the store. And it was a pretty close call with a tornado that time. So, moms are lovers and they're servers. They're such great examples for us. And she never got to see her grandchildren. But she will someday. Hebrews 11 is a great chapter. Hebrews 11 is a great chapter. And as you get into chapter 12, you find that great cloud of witnesses that I think Hebrews 11 is leading up to, and I know that my mom is some of that great cloud of witnesses. Encouraging us on, encouraging us to go to the final call, the closing line of this life, whenever that comes. And I know that she would want us to understand that this life is not what it's all about. We're not here forever. None of us are. We're here for a short time. And the more that we can learn that we are just pilgrims, and even the word that's used in certain translations, pilgrims and strangers, we'll be better off. We'll live more appropriately on this earth. We'll have a better understanding of what it's all about. There have been a lot of pilgrim movements throughout the history of this world, and we couldn't even begin to touch all of those. One that came to mind recently to me, we lived in Belize as missionaries for a while in Central America, and we lived beside a community of Mennonites. If you trace those Mennonites that live in Belize, you'll find that earlier they lived close to Chihuahua, Mexico, where still some Mennonites are there. And then those Mennonites had come from Canada, and there is a community of Mennonites there, and those Mennonites had come from Russia. As the 1800s were coming to a close, the Mennonite community, or people in Russia, found themselves face to face with what was going to become a very tyrannical government. And we look back with 2020 and understand they made a good decision to leave. And so they got out of Russia and moved to Canada. Some of them broke off, moved to Chihuahua, Mexico. Some of those broke off and moved to Belize. And that's where we met some really wonderful people. Every movement of those people was in search of freedom of their expression of religion, their expression of their belief in God. And to this day, there are some 12,000 of those that live in Belize, Central America. Very unique people. We're pilgrims. We're people who journey sometimes to a sacred place for religious reasons, and that's what our life is all about. That's what our life is all about. The literary use is a person regarded as journeying through life. He never really puts down roots anywhere because he's not going to stay there long. He's a foreigner. He's a stranger. That's a little bit of a test. Any Merle Haggard fans in the group, at least some of his songs were really wonderful songs. And he had a band that were called what? Merle Haggard and his... Oh no, come on, you Texans. Merle Haggard and his Strangers. This band was called the Strangers. Why? Because they never stayed in one place any length of time. They were strangers. They moved from one city to another on their tours. They were strangers. That's what he named them. Abraham was the first one we know of biblically that really stands out. God calls him out of Ur, and he calls him to a place that he's going to go. He says, Sarah, load up the mule, we got to leave. And she says, where are we going? And he says, I don't know. God's going to show us. And that wouldn't go over too well with most women that are put in charge of loading the mule. Because you kind of want to know where you're going, how long you're going, what you need to take, and all those answers. But Abram could only tell her that God's going to show us where we're going, and well, they went. Obviously, he saw something in Abram that he didn't see in his siblings. He calls Abram out of Ur. The use of the verb is he had called. So this is something that he had been calling Abram. He's beginning this journey. Through Abraham's promise, or the promise made to Abram, and later to Abraham, we understand and can relate with him that we too are a called people. We are called where? Out of the world to a kingdom of light. We're called into a kingdom that's eternal. And we are, therefore, Abraham's descendants, because we are receiving the inheritance that he had been promised, in a sense. Symbolically, it wasn't just a physical land that God promised him. God's looking far ahead and seeing a group of people that's going to be called his church later on. And we are the result of that. And what a blessing it is to be in God's church. Abraham did something. He was called and then he obeyed. It's not a real popular word these days. Just the idea of obeying. We don't, as American people, or kind of have a resistance there about just obedience. It's not a real popular concept. And yet we toss around this word of faith, even in the political realm. You'll have politicians, when they're running for office, talk about how they are a person of faith. And I'm thinking, I'm not sure you understand at all what you're saying. What is your concept of faith in what? Faith in who? We kind of like that idea that we're a person of faith. Well, you and I understand that that's faith in the creator of this universe. It's faith in he who has called us out of darkness and into light. By faith, in chapter 11, you have this list, and God begins to build this list. Faith is always accompanied with what? Action, works, the obedience that then shows that you do believe. And that's what I would call our people today of faith, to understand that it's submission to God's will to be a person of faith. By faith, Abel offers a better sacrifice. Enoch pleased God. Noah built an ark. Aren't you glad Noah didn't decide to shorten the ark by 1 foot? What a blessing it is that Noah followed all the instructions to detail. So thankful for him. Moses' parents hid him. Moses chose to be mistreated and then left Egypt. God had something for him to do, and he didn't understand what it was either. If he had have understood, he might have gone and tried to hide somewhere. But he didn't. The Israelites, they passed through the Red Sea. All of that is by faith. I love James chapter 2, verse 22. If there's any one verse that can define the kind of saving faith that God's asking us to have as pilgrims and strangers, it's James chapter 2, verse 22. You see that his faith, speaking of Abraham, his faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. Now, you're going to have to work real hard to misunderstand that. But still, some people are going to misunderstand what a saving faith is all about. His faith and his actions worked together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. He didn't know where he was going. He kept obeying. He made his home in the promised land. He lived there the rest of his life. He's a stranger. He's an alien. He's a foreigner. He's a pilgrim. You know, Abraham, all of this promise that God made, he never owned anything. He couldn't pull out a filing cabinet and say, oh, let's see, the title to this property and this property. He didn't have any of that, none of it. Until finally, when Sarah dies, he goes and buys a cave. They knew of this special place where they lived, and he bought this cave where he could bury Sarah, and someday he himself be buried there. That's the only place he ever owned, in that foreign country that God called him to. And just so we're not bored today, I want to read something to you. Charlotte and I have lived a lot of places, and it has gotten to the point it is challenging to remember all of them. I don't know if that's a truth for you, but even those, 1 month here or 2 months, where all the places where you have moved to and lived, it kind of gets scary. And if you think back on now I know why I'm tired. But listen to Abraham. You'll know why he was tired. He first went from Ur of Chaldea. He went to Haran. He went to Canaan. He traveled through the land of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. He went to the hills east of Bethel. He went to the Negev. He went to Egypt. He went back to the Negev. Then it says he just went from place to place. He went to Bethel. He went back to the great trees at Mamre at Hebron. He went back to the Negev between Kadesh and Shur. He went to Herar. He went to Beersheba. He went to Hebron. And he was finally buried in the purchased cave. I can't pronounce it. Pikla, near Mamre. I wonder how good we are at living as pilgrims. I'm not sure, as North Americans, if we don't have some resistance to that. Abraham lived in tents. It was humorous to read in the Christian Chronicle one time. This is back in the late 80s. I remember reading in the Christian Chronicle. I don't know why I was looking at those classified ads back there. Preachers wanted or preachers wanting. But there was this ad. This young preacher had this put in the Christian Chronicle. Preacher searching for position, seeking God's will in the Oklahoma City area. And I thought, well, that's pretty humorous. At least, he's giving God a little bit of room there to think where he might serve, at least in Oklahoma City. Are we really good pilgrims? I don't know. Paul was called to Macedonia. And even though it opened up a difficult time for him, it was a growing experience in God's kingdom. It's marvelous how God moved him where he took him. But as Paul would say later on, it's not so much, and this is my words, it's not so much where we live, but how we live. He would say, set your hearts and minds on things above, not on earthly things. Don't live as the Gentiles do. They're futile in their thinking. You were once darkness. Be light in the Lord. Live as children of light. The other thing that, Abraham was always doing, he was always leaning forward. You're from Texas, I'm from Oklahoma. We all share wind, we understand wind. There's some times you just got to lean forward if you're going into the wind. Try to stand straight up, you can get blown over. Abraham was always leaning forward and looking for what was next. He lived in tents. I don't know. Some of you may have been in the Army. You had some tent experience. Maybe you've done some camping. Think of an entire lifetime living in tents. That was the reality for Abraham. His family could move here and there, and it had some real advantages because if you're moving around all the time, it's kind of hard for an enemy to know how and where and easily attack you. It's a military-ready state at all times, living in a tent. It's that daily life of waiting on God, considering that God is faithful and that He's made a promise to take care of us. That's what He did to Abraham, and He took care of him, and Abraham became very, very blessed. He became a wealthy man and experienced God's blessing as he lived in that way. Every day. And this is, apply it to your life. Every day, Abraham, getting up and doing all those little repetitious things that's part of the reality of life, going and fetching the water, serving and caring for family and neighbors, recognizing the presence of God and seeking His will, choosing right over wrong, doing good, considering others before yourself. Paul put it this way: offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable, pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Abraham lived that way. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, months turned into years, years turned into decades. A pilgrim on this earth. Habakkuk 2 is repeated in Romans 1, and Paul repeats that really important statement that the righteous will live by faith. There might be another way to interpret that or to phrase that: the righteous will be saved in his faithfulness. Can we be faithful today? I can be faithful today. What about all week? What about all month? What about into next year? What about a lifetime? It's that kind of faithfulness that takes us from here to the end of our lifetime, however long that is. He looked forward to a city with foundations. That passage comes, I believe, out of Isaiah chapter 62, verse 5, where God is talking about Himself marrying His church later on. And he's termed as the architect and the builder. He's the builder of that foundation upon which Jesus Christ established His church. He says, as a young man marries a maiden, so will your builder marry you. And God is building something that is eternal, something that is... I stayed in almost a brand new home last night. A good friend in Sherman, outside of Sherman. What a beautiful home. And I'm thinking, this is a real place that's going to last a long time. God's construction is going to last eternity. These earthly tents we live in are going to be destroyed. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 says we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven. This here is going to waste away. Inwardly, we're being renewed day by day. We fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. Not on what is temporary, but what is eternal. I love Hebrews 11:16. These people, these foreigners, these strangers, they were looking for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for He has prepared a city for them. I believe it's a city for us. They weren't people who were thinking of a country of their own. They were thinking of the country they left. If they were thinking of the country they had left, they would have an opportunity to return, says the Scripture. In 1519, some of you are going to remember this story from your history books. In 1519, there was a man named Hernan Cortes. He had lived in Cuba, what we know as Cuba today, for a good while, and got a lot of men around him, and he was an ambitious fellow in the negative way. And he was bent on finding and capturing the gold of the Aztec Empire and conquering the Emperor Moctezuma in Mexico, as we know Mexico today. He only had about 600 soldiers, but he set out in about 11 ships from Cuba to the Yucatan of Mexico. And they landed on the Yucatan of Mexico, and by that time there was somewhat of a coup beginning in some of the men saying, you know, there's only 600 of us, what are we doing? We're gonna all be killed here, and it'd be better back in Cuba. Well, Cortez found out about that, and I'm not sure how he did away with those who were the leaders of the coup, but he did away with them. But then he did something that goes down in history and is applicable for us. He told his men to go burn the ships. They burned the ships. There was no returning. There was only going forward. We're going forward. And they marched into Mexico, and they, with difficulty, but successfully defeated the Emperor Moctezuma. I'm sure they found the gold they were looking for, but they considered it a victory. Thus the words of Paul. I press on. I press on to take hold of that for which Christ Jesus took hold of me. One thing I do, forgetting what is behind and straining forward toward the goal to win the prize for which God has called me heavenward in Christ Jesus. Philippians 3:12. These great people of Hebrews chapter 11. I love to read their stories, and I love the final summation of their lives as God just quits naming people and talks about all of the people of faith. They were commended for their faith, and yet none of them received what they had been promised in the sense as you and I have received. Yes, through faith they conquered kingdoms, they administered justice, they shut the mouths of lions, they quenched the fury of the flames, they escaped the edge of the sword, their weakness was turned into strength, they became powerful in battle, they routed foreign enemies, even the dead were raised. That really sounds good, doesn't it? That's not all, though. Yet others who lived by faith, through faith, they were tortured. They faced jeers and flogging. They were chained. They were put in prison. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were put to death by the sword. They dressed in sheep and goat skins. They were destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. They wandered in deserts and mountains. They lived in caves and holes in the ground. The world was not worthy of them. God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. I'm out of time, so I'm just going to close with a really beautiful reading as the Hebrew writer sums up. Speaking of you and me, we ought to really feel good about this. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 22. But you have come to Mount Zion, to heavenly Jerusalem, the city of the living God. You have come to thousands and thousands of angels in joyful assembly, to the church of the firstborn, whose names are written in heaven. You have come to God, the judge of all men, to the spirits of righteous men made perfect, to Jesus, mediator of the new covenant. Isn't it a blessing to be a pilgrim? It truly is. Well, you've got children, or you've had children. You've had grandchildren, many of us. You get in the car, You start off to the distant place you're going to, and it may only be an hour down the road, but that's distant for children. And you get out of the driveway, you're only just out of town, maybe 20 minutes into the trip, and you get the question, are we there yet? It's a question for us this morning. Are we there yet? You know what the answer is? Yes. Yes, we are there. But there's a whole lot more coming. That's going to be such a great blessing for God's people. It's such a blessing to be a pilgrim on this earth with our hand in the one who's leading us to the true promised land. And as we sit here this morning, I just want you to know, if we were to sing the song, when we all get to heaven, I somehow want you to envision those many, many people who have come to Christ in Ecuador and South America and Central America. And a brother talked to me this morning about the ministries in Africa. It's going to be an exciting day, isn't it? When we all get to heaven and finish this pilgrimage. If there's someone who needs to respond to the invitation this morning, if there's some need to express, if there's somebody who wants to begin that journey, we can help you express your faith by being immersed into Christ and begin walking as a new creation. Would you come while we stand and sing?